Brazil is the country of the future, and will always be the country of the future. For all the nations evaluated as potential superpowers, Brazil is the most overlooked. This is despite the fact that Brazil is one of the largest countries in the world both in terms of population and landmass, as well as one of the top 10 economies. It is also one of the most iconic and culturally influential. In spite of all of this, Brazil gets comparatively little attention compared to the other rising developing nations like China and India. To better understand this phenomenon, let's first look at Brazil's physical geography and ascertain what we can from it. The most obvious element of Brazil is its massive size, being far bigger than any other country in South America, and bordering nearly every other country on the continent with a few exceptions. The most obvious of Brazil's geographic features is, of course, the Amazon rainforest. This immense rainforest, the largest on Earth, has become the greatest source of biodiversity anywhere on the planet, and stories of its exploitation are endless. The Amazon is located within the northern third of the country, and basically acts as a buffer between that and other nations like Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, etc. This is fed by the Amazon River, the largest in terms of water volume. To the west lies the Andes Mountains, which do not reside in Brazil, but do feed many of Brazil's waterways, and oftentimes provide a barrier to other countries. To the south of the Amazon lies a flat savanna region. This area is rich in agricultural goods like bananas and soybeans, as well as a great deal of ranching. The coast, on the other hand, is covered in the Atlantic forest, a very mountainous forest which makes moving inland in terms of infrastructure, goods, resources, and ideas rather difficult for the nation of Brazil. Most of Brazil's population centers reside either on the coastlines or on nearby coastal plains, such as the city of Rio on the shores or Sao Paulo a little bit more inland. This has its roots in Brazil's track record as an export economy and a colony of Portugal. Brazil oftentimes needed access to the sea to bring their goods like Brazil wood, nuts, rubber, etc. to Europe. In general, the geographic features of South America, including Brazil, are both a blessing and a curse. They're a blessing because they create barriers that prevent entry. Many of these nations don't go to war that often for that reason. But at the same time, it can also stifle the movement of goods, services, and ideas. Further to the south lies the Pampas region, which is the coolest portion of Brazil. It is a temperate climate, fertile soil, and flat land. But at the same time, there are no natural barriers protecting them from other countries nearby. Moving on to the human foundations of its past. Brazil, at the end of the day, is a product of European colonialism. It was inhabited by various indigenous peoples. It was the Portuguese that really set up the colonies, though. After all, the Europeans were interested in exploring much of Asia, but alas, the Ottoman Turks had cut off land routes to many Christian Europeans, and many were seeking maritime routes. The Portuguese had already traveled around Africa and India, and eventually the Spanish reached the Caribbean through Christopher Columbus's voyages. The Portuguese eventually got sidetracked on one voyage and ended up landing in Brazil. This is despite the fact that the Pope split the world in two, a land where Portugal could colonize the east and Spain the west. But it didn't really work out that way, and hence we have Brazil. The name Brazil comes from the Brazil wood trees that were the most important export of the colony during its early history. For a while, the Portuguese were rather apathetic towards this colony, but once it was threatened by the French and Dutch a little more, they started to push for mass migration into the colony of Brazil, and the population exploded drastically. Soon tradesmen, missionaries, and naval vessels were patrolling Brazilian waters. Many Europeans were dying from tropical diseases, but the indigenous people suffered far more, as many were not used to the pathogens coming from the Old World. So the Portuguese had bought slaves from Africa, and this provided them with a massive slave labor force, unfortunately. The number of slaves shipped to Brazil is far higher than those shipped to the United States, and the brutality was even worse. The vast majority of them were male, and they kept needing to re-import more slaves in order to keep up the numbers. Slave-based economies are pretty terrible for innovation on top of that. The language barrier and rivalry with the Spanish also made it difficult for Brazil to really grow ties with many of its nearby neighbors. But nonetheless, there was a gold rush to make up for this, and so countless more people traveled to Brazil in search of tiny yellow metal and the fortune that it supposedly brings. And then we switch to Napoleon. During the Napoleonic Wars, Portugal was an ally of Britain, and the French were able to subjugate Portugal to a significant degree, which led the Portuguese monarchy to flee to Brazil. Pedro I eventually became the first true emperor of Brazil and told the Portuguese to go away. By the standards of his time, the Brazilian Empire was fairly progressive. Pedro I's son, Pedro II, royals are pretty unoriginal when naming their kids, ended up forging a lot of trade relations, as well as expanding education, and he banned slavery. He was kicked out in a coup and eventually died in exile in Europe. The republic that took over wasn't really a republic at all, but as we all know, governments are pretty good at BSing themselves when it comes to naming situations. Over the coming decades, there would be a long line of military dictatorships. The most notable event during the mid-20th century is, of course, World War II, and Brazil was the only Latin American country to really provide any sort of substantial role in the war effort. After the war, Brazil would eventually move its capital from Rio de Janeiro to the center, a centrally planned city known as Brasilia, which was based around modern architecture and urban planning principles, even though it didn't exactly work out too well at the end. Brasilia looks quite impressive from certain angles at a bird's eye view, however it's not very walkable and by and large is considered to be a fairly boring bureaucratic city in sharp contrast to much of the vibrancy you see in other Brazilian nations. Nonetheless, in 1985, Brazil eventually got a civilian government and became a democracy, which it still is to this day. This was part of a democratic wave that was going on during the 1980s across Latin America and other parts of the world, as well as the Iberian Peninsula, the countries where Latin America traces its origin to. While the city of Brasilia was a failure by an urban planning perspective, it did manage to consolidate some power within the interior of the nation, which throughout much of its history had been largely ignored, and oftentimes was under the purview of various criminals. While far away from the coolest parts of Brazil and quite possibly the most boring part of Brazil, Brasilia has managed to exert more influence in the Amazonian regions, which have been the most economically isolated. Part of this is a bit of a thorny subject because you want to preserve the Amazon and protect it, but on the other hand, you want to make sure that the people living there have a decent standard of living. With improved relations with Argentina, Brazil has moved many of its troops into the Amazon region and has specialized many of its battalions for rainforest warfare. Brazil is pretty secure in terms of its physical geography when it comes to foreign policy because on one hand, there is a tremendous amount of strategic depth due to its size and its population, and most of its neighboring countries have population centers that are separated by vast borders. Mountains, deserts, jungles, and swamps oftentimes straddle the borders of the South American continent. For this reason, interstate warfare is quite rare in South America across much of its history. Militaries oftentimes pose a greater threat to their own people than they do to other states. Brazil's true threats lie within corruption and crime. Corruption is quite rampant in Brazil on all levels of government, particularly in the form of fund siphoning. This leads to a loss of funds for a lot of major state-owned corporations in particular. A lot of these practices have resulted in rampant income inequality, and in many ways, this is still based off of the Iberian social structure, autocracy and nobility. Many of these problems are compounded by crime sprees, which are quite common in Brazil, and Brazilian cities are among some of the most dangerous in the world, particularly in the northeast area, in cities like Salvador, where poverty is particularly high. However, Brazil does have its advantages, especially on the world stage. Brazil is the only major power I can think of that gets along with pretty much everybody. Sure, there are some spats here and there with bordering nations like Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Look up the Paraguay War if you want to see something really weird and crazy. But nonetheless, the country, generally speaking, believes in multilateralism, and it doesn't pose a major threat to anyone, and overall is a fairly open country. It's unlikely that any country poses any true threat to Brazil at this point. For this reason, Brazil is kind of like the fairly benign regional power of South America. Meanwhile, the other major power in the Western Hemisphere, the US, maintains warm yet distant relations with Brazil. Both countries are incredibly diverse nations of immigrants, with very oftentimes pluralistic cultures. Both adhere to liberal democracy, albeit with some hiccups in both countries as of late. Brazil also has warm relations with the European Union, particularly its colonial overlord, Portugal. Much of the ugly history has been brushed to the side, I guess, and Brazil by and large maintains friendly relations with both Western and non-Western rising powers. It's part of the BRICS group, composed of Brazil, obviously, along with Russia, India, China, and South Africa. BRICS has been met with mixed reviews. For one, many smaller developed nations view BRICS as just another big club of bullies that are not that different than Western bullies, but still are bullies nonetheless. What's remarkable about Brazil's growth, regardless of all of this, is that it's been fairly non-threatening, unlike, say, that of China's. Brazil has managed to make one of the largest economies in the world without really annoying any other power. Granted, this may be because its growth, while impressive, isn't quite as impressive as China's. However, aside from that, I think it also has to do with its relative geographic isolation. It's also rich in soft power and culture, and emphasizes a multilateral foreign policy. On top of that, Brazil does not have nuclear weapons, unlike many of the others I mentioned. And yes, while the growth hasn't been anywhere near as impressive as, say, India's, it has nonetheless grown. However, this growth has also led to a great deal of income inequality, even though the average person's standard of living has been risen drastically over the past several decades. Nonetheless, the images you see of the contrasts in the urban architecture are quite astounding. If you travel around many Brazilian cities, you will have rich gated communities that sometimes commute by helicopter. At the same time, you will have impoverished favelas, which are oftentimes seen as mountain-side slums. Brazil's economy is also heavily based on raw materials and agriculture. Agriculture is their most well-known import, even more than that of mining. Agriculture is the big head honcho of the Brazilian economy, being primarily driven by exports, and this gets the country a great deal of revenue. However, most of these jobs pay fairly low wages, and many family farms are struggling to compete with a lot of the megacorps. Regardless of this issue, the megacorporations have invested in a lot of research and technology that have become profitable for Brazil as a whole. This is of particular note when it comes to certain genetically modified crops, most notably soybeans, along with coffee and other produce. Putting genetically modified soybeans aside, another very important export is sugarcane, which is used for ethanol. Using sugarcane is far more effective and productive for ethanol than producing ethanol from, say, corn, which the US does. However, there have been some controversies over the destruction of rainforests. Yet, much of the research shows that destruction of rainforest isn't really tied that much to sugarcane, and much of the sugarcane growing happens in the pampa savannas. Moving on to the big picture. If Brazil wants to be a great power, it will need to diversify as an economy outside of predominantly mining and agriculture, perhaps invest in information technology or something else. Something that can be done by investing in its people through education and expanding social services, as well as improving infrastructure and connecting much of the desolate, well, not so desolate in terms of landscape, but desolate in terms of people, center and northern parts of the country from the coastal south, where much of the action is happening. At the end of the day, I think that Brazil is not necessarily the country of the future per se, but it does rather have a bright future nonetheless. Not astounding growth, but steady growth. Maybe perhaps growth that is easier to manage, and without the baggage of some of the growth that we've seen in other countries. Brazil deserves a lot more attention than what we give it. Oftentimes international news stories just cover football or botched butt injections. And I think that there's so much more to learning about this fascinating country than that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you learned something, like and subscribe, or give it a thumbs down and leave a hate comment. Either way, I appreciate it. Thanks, and see you on the next one.